again. My name is Nikki Samuel, and I'm the program coordinator at the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office. I want to first off thank you for coming and attending our virtual session, and I want to also welcome you into this virtual space as we engage in this critical and important dialogue to reflect, to learn from one another, especially in terms of how do we have these difficult conversations about race, racism, and in particular anti-Black racism with our family members and our children. So I have up on this slide here a symbol. So when we start to think about symbols across cultures and around the world, symbols have been used to connote specific meanings, ideologies. They're used to represent things within your specific culture. So the image that I've put up is a West African, Adinkra symbol, which connotes love, safety, security, particularly as it relates to family. So I'm acknowledging that this is a West African symbol, and these symbols are not homogeneous across the continent or across tribes or countries within the continent. I do want to sort of ground the space in this particular symbol for the sheer fact that understanding that while these symbols aren't homogeneous, there is an indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing that cultures have expressed over time. And the reason why I want to bring that, because it's very personal to me, being a member of the diaspora and also identifying as Caribbean, that these symbols express a way, a strength, a beauty, a knowledge, a wisdom, a resiliency of a history of Black and African people that did not begin with enslavement. And it's important that we, in this time, take a moment to remember that. Okay. So as we sort of move through begin and in grounding this work and also acknowledging that all families aren't spaces of love and security and safety, we want to ensure that we prioritize a space that we can come together to learn and to stretch. And so that we can continue our collective work in speaking up and speaking out against all forms of violence and oppression in our society. So we are mindful of the security concerns while using this platform. And if there are any major disruptions that interrupts the host's ability to keep control of the platform, we will ask that you log off immediately and the session will be rescheduled. So in the spirit of community and collectivity, this is how we will frame the conversation moving forward. Just to let you know that this session is being recorded. We will pause the recording for the Q&A portion of the segment, just to allow for comfortability in the space. If you do not want to be recorded, please ensure that you turn off your your video during this call. And in terms of the agenda, so we'll begin with a land acknowledgement, then I will invite Kay Francis to do our welcoming and opening remarks, and then we will move into our community discussion with panelists. Finally, we will have a Q&A portion, and then we will have closing remarks. Next slide. So as we're gathered here today, we must remember that no matter where we are in our respective homes, communities, and neighborhoods, that we're gathered on Indigenous land. I want us to take a moment and recognize the land and the benefits that we've received from this land, and for the stewards of this land who continue to care for it. This land has given us much, and we are grateful and humble to live and work and play. But gratitude and humility aren't ever enough. and we all have a collective role to play in creating a more equitable and just society. And it begins by continuing to commit and recommit to true acts of reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation are not just words, it is a collective call to action. And we're going to be having some great conversation around how we can take up this collective call to action and implement them in our daily lives. So I would like to take a moment to invite Kay Francis, who is the manager of the Family Care Office, to provide our opening remarks for today's discussion. Kay has been the manager of the Family Care Office for over 15 years, and in this role provides information on guidance, referrals on a broad range of family issues to students, staff, and faculty. Prior to this position, she has worked in the Career Center, the International Student Center, and the Career Transition Center at the University of Toronto. She is a graduate of U of T and has her MA in Sociology and Equity Studies. She's also a mother of two. Her children are aged 14 and 12. Please join me in welcoming Kay.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikki. And welcome to our discussion today about talking about racism at home. My name is Kay Francis. I'm the manager of the Family Care Office, and I've been asked to give some opening remarks on today's panel. I am very grateful to ARCDO, first of all, for providing me this opportunity. Speaking to our children about racism is something that is top of mind right now. We have the recent murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, the investigation of the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and the subsequent protests. But the list of events do not seem to end. Speaking to your kids about racism is a difficult topic. During a pandemic, it is even more difficult. With the pandemic, we're working from home and physically isolating. We're doing more homeschooling. We're seeing the rise of anti-Asian racism and the fact that those from Black and other visible minority communities are facing COVID-19 very differently. So while trying to keep everyone safe, we're also asking parents to consider taking on the topic of racism with their children. University of British Columbia psychology professor Andrew Barron, who specializes in the origins of race bias, has said his own research has shown children already have implicit bias. That is unconscious thoughts and feelings about social and racial groups. And this is by the time they're out of kindergarten. So talking to kids about racism is something we really have to consider, and perhaps at a younger age than we've actually ever thought. We should also consider, for those of us who are not talking to our children about race, is this a privilege? Because we are not Black. Bias exists, and talking about this with our children is sometimes something we need to take responsibility for and cannot be ignored. Rather than allowing others to teach our children, this panel, I hope, provides some ideas and strategies we can use ourselves. How to be an effective ally is also important to understand for those not of the Black, racialized, or Indigenous communities. As an ally, you're not asking to be educated on these issues, but are attending panels such as today's, or reading widely, or you're consuming the art and media of those of people of color. We need to listen to those in marginalized communities and allow them the ability to articulate what they are facing as a Black or brown person and decide what is best for them. Listen and learn, speak out against racism, and use your privilege. This will not be easy, and it does take practice. In terms of the Family Care Office, we're providing services to current students, staff, and faculty at U of T. We're providing information, guidance, referrals, and educational programming, generally on topics such as planning for a child, looking for childcare or schools, or caring for an aging relative or a loved one. During this pandemic, this has also meant assisting staff understand what options they have if they have childcare responsibilities. For student staff and faculty to understand how to parent during this time or care for an elderly loved one. For student parents, we've also done some workshops on advocacy and studying at home with children. My director has also been involved with developing the memo that recently went out from the VP of HR and Equity on flexible work arrangements to accommodate caregiving responsibilities. Some upcoming events that we're planning include things like advocacy webinars on both the verbal and written for student parents. We're looking at doing a webinar on gender and sexual diversity. We're doing sessions or webinars on Black fatherhood, advocacy needs in the school system. And these are going to be in addition to the webinars we're doing typically on pregnancy issues, baby and toddler talks, parenting, and elder care. If you have further suggestions on topics or blog posts, please email us. We're available at family.care@utoronto.ca, and we're always open to suggestions. I'm the mother of 2 children, and I hope to learn, like those attending today's conversation, how to speak to our children about racism. Thank you all, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Kay, for sharing those remarks. So as we move into today's community discussion, I just want to also just reiterate what I said at the beginning of the call, that if there's any sort of interruptions and we're unable to control the platform, we will ask you to log off immediately. Also, in terms of moving forward in this collective framework, to ensure that, we engage in dialogue that is appropriate. And if any individuals are being disruptive within the space, we will, take steps to remove you, unfortunately. So with that said, I just want to introduce today's discussion. So talking about racism at home. So I'd like to introduce some of the panelists that'll be joining us here today. So I have Mary McKenna Edwards, Michelle Brownwig, and Yassine Dwyer. So I'm going to read out a bit of their bios just to give you a context of who they are and what experiences that they will be bringing into the space. So Mari is the Student Life Coordinator for Diversity and Inclusion Training at the University of Toronto. She wakes up every morning excited to create spaces for people to experience and learn from each other meaningfully, so that every person sees their possible contribution that can improve our world. Mari brings hope to difficult conversations with an appreciation for levity and play, to keep in mind that at the heart of this work is us all being connected. Mari has degrees in psychology, anthropology, and community development, social planning, policy development, and her years of work running community-based programming for children, youth, and families, working in higher education, and having been a consultant to offer practical examples of how theory and practice meet in our everyday lives. Mari lives in Toronto with her family, and her favorite pastime is hanging out in the backyard with her kids and eating amazing creations made by her hubby on the barbecue.
Yeah.
So, Mari. Thank you, Mari. Next, we have Michelle Brownwig. Michelle is the Senior Director and Chief Program Officer for Heart House at the University of Toronto. She works with an interdisciplinary team who work with many partners on initiatives that foster civic and community engagement, facilitate various forms of arts expression, and support overall wellness with consideration for those who have been underserved and underrepresented in this programming. Prior to her role at Heart House, Michelle was the Director of Physical Activity and Equity at UFT in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, and has a long history of varied work in the NGO sector focused on children, youth, and families. She was a course director at the Faculty of Health at York University in a course exploring health disparities. In all these experiences and beyond, Michelle is most grateful for her daily learning she's provided as a parent to 2 daughters. Join me in welcoming Michelle Browning. And finally, we have Yassine Dwyer, who was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba to Jamaican parents. He is the Executive Director of the Muslim Chaplain Association, Muslim Chaplaincy of Toronto. Before joining the Muslim Chaplaincy of Toronto, Yassine was a part of a multi-faith chaplaincy team at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He has lectured extensively on topics such as religion and the arts, Black Canadian culture, and the history of Muslims in the West, along with working alongside many nonprofit organizations in Canada. Yassine was the first full-time Muslim chaplain to work with the Correctional Services of Canada, a position he held for 11 years. He is also a board member of the Montreal-based Institute Route de la Silk Road Institute, sorry, the Silk Road Institute, my French is deplorable, which is dedicated to expressing Canadian Muslim narratives through visual, auditory, and performing arts. Join me in welcoming Yassine. Okay, so just to do a mic check for everybody, Mari, you can hear me?
I can hear you. Good morning.
Michelle, you can hear me?
Morning, everyone.
Okay, and Yassine, you can hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to move into our first question. And I'm going to pose this question to Michelle. So just to remind panelists, you have about 3 to 4 minutes in terms of responses. Obviously, I'm not going to interrupt you if like something is very pressing and it needs to be said within the space, but just be mindful of time and sharing talk time. So question 1, share your earliest memory you have about talking about race with your children. How did this conversation or event impact you as a parent? And how did it impact your children following this conversation? So Michelle, I want to start off by hearing from you and gathering some of your thoughts before I pass it along.
Sure, and I will do my very best to be succinct, which is not always my strength. So, but I do want to just begin with a bit of an understanding of who my children are and our family. So I am the white mother of 2 mixed race Black children who, in addition to my settler English, Irish, Scottish heritages, have their fathers Jamaican, Chinese histories and culture, including a Chinese surname. They are very different humans as people. They have perspectives and engage in these conversations around race and racism based on who they are and how they identify. My older daughter is a Seneca College graduate attending Humber in a graduate certificate in the fall. She is on ASD spectrum with learning differences, which afford her an incredible work ethic, an ability to focus in a very particular way that has been manifested in her achievements in school, her writing, and as a high-level athlete, and also involves some notable social anxieties that are interestingly coupled with a very heightened sensitivity to distress in humanity, and being an empath who sort of takes it all on. My younger daughter is highly social, expressive, deeply creative, and artistic storyteller whose attentional style involves many infrequent shifts in focus, and as only a teenager, has a high ability to navigate emotionally complex situations, often and well, with crashes. Those come few and far in between, and they tend to run very deep, and they are typically arrive without warning because of her ability to navigate in an ongoing way. I myself find it very interesting to navigate these discussions of which I do not have the lived experience to relate to, the implicit biases that I carry from my own upbringing and the systems within which I work and have been educated. I'm working hard to always be youthful in discussions and actions on racism without appropriating experiences that are not mine. And that becomes particularly complex when it's in a parenting dynamic. So I will never have the lived experiences that my children have and continue to have. And so just always trying to be thinking about that in addressing some of the conversations that we do have. I was joking with Nikki yesterday that any question that asks me to draw on my earliest memories is a good challenge. I appreciate that. And it was difficult to just name just one. There are a number of things. So earliest memories going to pregnancy and just family conversations about my pregnancy, which was a chosen pregnancy. I was never legally married or ceremonially married to the father of my children. That was a conscious decision. There were a lot of family inputs with respect to that decision during my first pregnancy in particular that had decided racial overtones about those choices and what that meant. And so right from those initial conversations, just navigating that prior to birth in terms of my children and how they would then have to navigate that. lots of things that you start to become differently aware of that are just, you know, in the simple day-to-day things that you think about. What are you going to do in terms of what your home looks like? What books are there? What toys are there? And all of those pieces. But one of my earliest memories, again, was when Sola was a baby, and we were at a fabric land. It was about an hour north of the city of Toronto, and I was with her. She was quite young, and my partner at the time was with his daughter, who was about 10, actually about 11 or 12 at the time, and the cooing and awing over a new baby that happens with their big round heads and their big eyes, and then all of a sudden, when my partner joined me at the cache, and the complete difference in the engagement from the women who worked there with us as a family. Sola as a small child, and just some of those discussions when my second child was born, and just discussions around identity, not necessarily with respect to racism, but in relation to race, and her having a very clear need to understand what her complexion should be described as, which was different than her sisters, and her need to identify that she, you know, was cocoa and Marley was cinnamon, and that was how she wanted to define things at the time, and there was a need for her to somehow understand that in those tones. I need to talk about hair. You know, hair as a white, very straight-haired mother, I get a lot of input from all communities around hair. The father of my children has dreadlocks. My younger daughter has a straight up, fine-haired, mixed race afro. My middle daughter has a mixed hair that perhaps looks somewhat like Marley's. Everybody has an opinion on their hair. People feel it's quite appropriate to touch Marley's hair in the subway, at gatherings at school, in events that she's been at where she's been representing her school, to make comment on her hair, to straighten her hair, to not straighten her hair. Am I using the right product? Do I understand black hair product? Do I understand mixed hair product? Random conversations in bathrooms, on subways, all of which is just very interesting for all of us to navigate from the different you know, spaces we occupy in the hair of our family. My older daughter once asking, because she finds wide open, more rural spaces very calming for her. Why did I have to live in a city? I don't understand why you and daddy would do that. And him trying to explain to her, you know, where his mother was comfortable when she chose to emigrate from Jamaica, and to try and describe that in a way that she would understand, and why an urban setting like Toronto, where more of her community was available to her, was very different than the rural setting in which she had to work each day and travel to each day, and the experiences of racism she had in those spaces, and then the ones she also had in the city of Toronto, and having those conversations with her very young. I will wrap up as well in terms of just acknowledging the older sister of my children, and as a white, you know, parent figure in her life, and not being her parent, an experience when she was younger of going to a Jamaican food store to pick up some things for her grandmother, and her not coming in, which was a combination of, I think, her not wanting to come in with me, as well as a combination of her not having comfort in a Black space as a mixed race child herself. And so just having that conversation, and all of these things happening in real time and in the moment, and with complete inability to address them almost every time that you're just navigating on the spot. I hope that's helpful as a starting.
Thank you, Michelle, for being very raw and very open. And I do agree with some of your sentiments around feeling as myself being look-wise racially ambiguous, but holding varied identities of like Black, South Asian, as well as Venezuelan roots, and having two parents that look different and not being comfortable within spaces. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to move on in terms of hearing a response from Mari, just in terms of share some of your earliest memories and what was the impact. And Mari, you could take this conversation the way you need to be, but I will time you with your 4 minutes.
Okay, I got a timer on me. Morning, y'all. Mari, she, her pronouns. I also want to kind of offer some context. I have two children. I have a 7-year-old and I have a 12-year-old who in this moment identify as female. And we are a settler family. I am what we often call as biracial. We can unpack that later. I am of Jamaican on one side and Irish Scottish on the other side is my descent. My husband, I'm just going to call O instead of just saying, like, I think that's my nickname for him. So I'm going to say my husband, O'Neill, who many of you know, immigrated from Jamaica. Classically, when he stayed in Jamaica with his grandmother for many years and then immigrated with his parents here. My children are younger, and so I'm going to talk about the things that I have their consent to talk about, and I'm going to be broad in some ways because sometimes they're not old enough to, I feel, give me consent to be able to share information about them in this format. There are people in my household who have different levels of ability. They're not neurotypical. They have different ways that they learn. I'm not going to say too much about what that affords them because for identifying reasons. We are a multi-faith family. We have Christian, Muslim, and Jewish practices in our day-to-day life. We have had conversations as this moment, though we all identify as cis. We were all assigned one gender, and we still identify in the world would identify as cisgenders. And at this point, there's been no clear declarations in terms of orientation outside of O and I. I think that's important to contextualize. The last thing I want to say about that is that I was transracially adopted. So I was adopted as an infant by white parents. And that is relevant and important in the way that I was raised because it influenced the world, how I understand this conversation in this world, because there was not a conversation for me growing up and there were not role models around me growing up experiencing a great deal of racism. So I'm going to fast forward now, and I'm happy to answer questions later about that, but I want to make sure I talk about the impact. So I don't have a memory of when the conversation started. We were always talking about race. We were very mindful about talking about race, but not just race. We were very mindful of a practice of, one of my friends put it so lovely, a practice of noticing. That book doesn't have anyone who looks like our family. That book, everybody's skinny. So we were very mindful of starting up with a practice of noticing and having a moment of being aware of what is being presented, what is there and what isn't there. When I asked everybody in the family, do you remember an original moment? Nobody could remember one. We all thought it probably started around conversations of color and hair and everyday moments. For example, my best friend's children, although they're Colombian, they're very, very pale. And so when I would take care of their kids and we would go out, everyday moments like we're popping outside for 20 minutes and we would never think of putting sunscreen on. When we were taking care of their kids, we had to think of sunscreen. And so everyday things in our life that brought us into contact with different ways of everyday life started to kind of bring that up. So we didn't have an explicit moment of remembering, but at the same time, my partner O and I were very mindful and very conscious of having an ongoing conversation. Of course, we would have books, of course, the pictures around, of course, the role models, the history of their names. It was very, very organically already in our life. I want to talk about the impact, though. Talking about race, when I asked my eldest daughter, and I have her permission to tell this story, when I asked her this question, her memory of the first thing she thought of, although I asked her about understanding of race, her earliest memory was the police pulling her and my husband over and searching the car. That's her answer at 12 of her earliest memory of race. When I asked my husband about the situation, O couldn't even remember the situation, had to stop and think about it. When we figured out what it was, she was in kindergarten to the points that Kay was making. And to O, it was a very simple everyday moment, like, oh, that one wasn't so bad. He was a rolling stop, they pulled me over, they searched the car. As a very light-skinned Black woman, I have a very different read on that situation. I don't think I've ever been stopped for a rolling stop. I don't think my car has ever been searched, although I've been pulled over by the police. What I want to acknowledge is that my daughter made sense of it that way, that was her understanding and how and how she read that situation. So when I talk about impact, I want to acknowledge that part of why we're talking about it early and why we made the decision to talk about it early is because the world is hitting her. And she did not take it personally. She understood that this was something external happening to us, and she understood why it was happening. Also, she didn't think of the numerous situations that had already had happened to her of anti-Black racism in kindergarten. She didn't think of those incidents. Now, I want to acknowledge there, because there's a lot of educators here and a lot of parents here, she was in a learning environment that was half Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Her preschool environment was half of that. And she had educators who were incredibly mindful about that. So the situations that happened didn't land on her in the same way. So I just want to talk about that impact. The last thing I'm going to say about impact on O and I is that as we do that, though, like so many things in parenting, we personally relive this stage in development and where we were and the things that happened to us. And so when we talk about impact and talking about race, there's also the very personal reality of being triggered and being remembering what went right and what didn't go right, and the opportunity for healing when we can think about how we want that situation to be handled in a different way and doing our best to do it. My buzzer's gone.
Thank you, Mari, for sharing that and for being so open around some of the experiences. And I do recognize that some of these questions will elicit a lot of like emotional responses to them. So I thank you for being raw and honest throughout the whole process of responding. I want to turn it now to Yassine to share your thoughts on this question.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office for the kind invitation to speak about this very difficult and sometimes polarizing topic of race and culture. It's not lost upon me as a chaplain how difficult it can be to unpack these things, especially accompanied by a lot of the very ugly images that we've been seeing over the past few weeks through social media, through the news, and the general, horrifying nature of the situation. So it's very admirable for you to, bring us all together. I was unaware that there would be, at last count, 444 participants. So I'll make sure that I'm as concise as possible. Yes, I was born of Jamaican parents. And my wife was born of parents from Trinidad and Tobago, with many family members coming from Venezuela, which is just to the south of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, to be honest with you, when it comes to matters of race, we don't necessarily intentionally speak about this compared to culture. Being of Caribbean memory plays a very important role in the way that we navigate our way through the world. And as Muslims as well, I mean, myself, my wife, we both converted to Islam, in our early 20s. We grew up in the church, my wife being part of the Catholic Church. My father was part of the Methodist Church of Jamaica. We converted to Islam, and that conversion had a lot to do, not only with faith, but also had a lot to do with culture. Because we saw in the religion of Islam, a return to an African memory. And in the Caribbean, as I'm sure being educators and being very educated people, that the Caribbean is a land, an area of the world that was home, or was the receiving end of many enslaved Africans who suffered the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Many of them came from West Africa, and many of them came from Muslim nations like the Fulani, the Mandinka, the Wolof people, etc. So our discovery of Islam really was a return to an authentic African memory. So this is where we were coming from when we came to Islam. So our conversations within our home with our children, we have 4 children. The oldest right now is 24, a 24-year-old son, 21-year-old daughter, 18-year-old son, 16-year-old daughter. Our conversations about culture and race usually return to our scripture. And the Quran is very concise and very clear and very unequivocal concerning who we are as human beings, that indeed God says we made you of male and female, we made you into nations and tribes so that you may recognize each other, so that you may recognize each other. And verily the most honored of you are those who are most mindful, most conscious, most aware of God. This is the template through which we speak about this thing that we call race, because it's not lost upon me as well that, you know, the whole concept of race is very controversial. What is the African race? Who belongs to the Caucasian race? Who belongs? The idea of classification and categorization can be very complicated to actually the point of ridiculousness. Because even in the Caribbean, you'll find such a soup of diversity that it's very difficult to classify people into one or another race. In fact, the slogan of Jamaica is out of many, one. Out of many, one. So this brings up another issue that, you know, I'd like, you know, our participants to consider, that, you know, there is no such thing as a default Blackness. There is no such thing as a default way to understand your own particular memory that revolves around so-called race. That's very important for us to understand, because there's as much diversity in the Black experience as we may find in the rest of humanity, okay? We all have multiple identities that make up the human beings that we are. I myself, as I mentioned before, am a Muslim with a Christian background. I was born right here in Canada. My memory is a Jamaican memory or an African memory, okay? All of us have the same dynamic that make up the human being that we are. So we have to be very, very careful about allowing the projection of race to unnaturally impact upon how we navigate our way through the world, right? So I think that's a message that I try to, at least I plant the seed of that thought within the hearts of my children, so that they can recognize that the question of identity can be complicated, but children, the miracle of children is that they navigate through this in a very organic, honest, and innocent way. I'm very curious to hear about the study from the psychologist in British Columbia that seemed to come to the conclusion that somehow, you know, the idea of implicit bias is somehow, you know, found within kindergarten age children. I'm very curious to hear, you know, how he came to that conclusion, because I was curious. You know, that's much different from, you know, what we've heard concerning how children interact with the world and how children interact with each other. So I think those are some thoughts that I had about my own family, my own children. Revolves around our spiritual groundings. It revolves around making sure that we don't, you know, create some sort of default Blackness within our children, and especially as my sisters were mentioning, you know, being of a biracial background, having biracial children, we have to be careful, you know, about imposing certain definitions upon our children about who you are. No, it grows in a much more organic way than we think. I think the problem with adults is that, you know, we think too much and we make things a little bit too complicated for our children, when our children really, you know, are born pure. They're born innocent, and they're born already with the tools to be able to navigate their way through a very complicated world. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Yassine, for sharing your comments and like contextualizing, and also for complicating this notion of Blackness and what does it mean, and how the Black identity is not just boxed in as like people I find tend to want to box it in. I think like my takeaway from your response is that the imposition of these identities on children, and particularly as myself, who is expecting with a West African partner, it's a good reminder to us around how would this person identify racially, and allowing that to happen organically for them. So I really, really thank you for your response on that. We're going to move on to question 2, and Maria, I'd like to start with you. So given the recent protest demonstrations occurring both globally and within Canada, how are you having conversations about anti-Black racism with your family? So your children, partner, extended families, and how are these conversations happening presently within your own personal space?
In 3 minutes, okay.
No pressure.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna try to hit things that are useful. Okay, with the little one who is 7, like Michelle said, my children are, like many are, they're very different. And their ways of meeting the world and making sense of the world, and the way that the world meets them is very different. So I'm gonna just call them we, it's small bouts of very specific and thought out kind of conversations with her around information, basic information. And then she will often quickly move to another topic. We'll go with her. But the other half of that is a lot of care. One of the ways that she meets the world is very much around her emotions. She's or sad, she knows first, and she's there for a hug, and she'll go get the tissue if someone's crying. She's that kid. And so very much supporting her around the feelings that she might be picking up in the family. So the care for her is some information, but then also really caring with her and talking with her about the feelings in the family. And then she's also present for conversations with the big kid, that she has the control of coming in and coming out of, and controlling how much she's there. So being very mindful of that. I'll just say that quickly. Big, who's 12, this is a kid who is so analytical. She wants to pull out the theory, she's looking for connections with the world. She is understanding the analysis, she's understanding the impacts. So the conversations with her are taking her somewhere else, away from just small conversations. I got to be prepared. I got to have my information. I got to be really thinking it before I come to her, and really making space and holding space for her to work through the thinking of it. It's also because she's 12, and this is not our first case. This is not the first time we've gone through this. Yes, this is a different moment, but there's been so many cases. Being really thoughtful and thinking around how friends are influencing that. She's on all these group chats with her friends, with her sisters, with her. She has all these groups, and some of our family is very political. Some of her friends are very political from different perspectives, and I know she's engaged in those conversations with them. So some of the ways that I can talk about this is, hey, how did so-and-so, what's so-and-so saying about this? So creating space also to correct misinformation, take up things that's being talked about between the groups, and sending this message of we're there for the conversation. The other piece is teaching her how to curate social media and news. To give you a sense, when I sat down with her phone to kind of do this, I discovered that she hadn't only activated like the regular news app on her phone. She downloaded the app for the New York Times. And I was like, oh, okay. Didn't think that, there I go on my own stereotypes. Didn't think a 12-year-old would have been like, yes, let's make sure I'm keeping up with the New York Times. So teaching her about curating and taking care of herself in this moment, and so part of with information and how it's entering into her life and having a control over that. And then again, that piece about self-care, being mindful of the emotions and the feelings that are happening in our house, because my partner and I are having a lot of feelings and thoughts about this too, and also being kind of upfront with her that, mom and dad are going to go have a conversation. We need to have some private time because we're going to take care of ourselves. And I tell her, that's why I have I talk to my girlfriends on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesdays. I have my special conversations with my friends because that's how I take care of myself. Inviting them into my meditate. We have a family meditation and prayer practice. teaching them how to take care of themselves and languaging and making those connections with the ways that we function in our world. Part of our family have less contact with, our family that's descended through Jamaica, O's family. So, but we haven't had, because of COVID, we haven't had the opportunity to talk with my parents as much over the last few weeks. Also because I work in equity and I'm a little busy. And so there's been less time for chats. But I would say in that we are also, because our family had to go through conversations about how we talk about race, as I have been growing up and coming up and challenging my parents in how we didn't talk about race. We talked about everything else, but we didn't talk about race. And so our family has already done some processing about this. And so we have already established a way of talking about this, but I also have to be aware that there are beloved white people in my children's life. And so being really intentional about messaging that's going on and being really clear that this isn't about, like, one question that one of my kids says is, can I still love Shawnee and Granddad? Those are my parents. And it's like, yes. So having those conversations and creating space for that and the nuance of it. Okay, that was it, and my buzzer went off.
Thank you, Mari. I think that you've left us all with a lot to sort of unpack there, particularly around like how you navigate as a parent with respect to like media and taking into consideration like your kids' personalities and who needs what at a particular moment, as well as engaging in self-care and also like having your private time with you and your partner to have these sorts of conversations, as well as your support circle to continue engaging in these conversations, and also acknowledging like the myriad of identities within your network and having these conversations with your kids about them. So lots to unpack, and I'm sure we will unpack it as we move into the Q&A portion of it. So I want to turn the table to Michelle. So Michelle, give us your thoughts on this question.
Thank you for the opportunity to try and respond to this. I'm going to, again, just contextualize a little bit, because for each one of these questions, I tried to think about my children and where they are at right now with respect to them trying to respond to your questions as their parent. And so if I look at 2015 to 2020 in their lives and where we're at now, so if we look at from when they would have been, 5 and 10 to now at this stage, 16 and 21, they have gone through separation in terms of my 17-year relationship with their father. They have had to leave their family home, renting in a new neighborhood where the van attack began on our street within months of us moving into this neighborhood. My older daughter has had 2 notable injuries requiring MRI and has managed to have a concussion since the closure of COVID. My younger daughter has gone through the death of the school teacher during COVID, so no opportunity to engage with her community around that loss. Their father is in Jamaica and cannot return currently as he went to engage with the property there. And both my mother and brother have had to have hospital visits, non-COVID related, but still COVID impacted as part of this. So I was just trying to think, as we are now moving into more and more heightened engagement, I'd like to say the word engagement, with respect to the blatant violence and racism that has always been present, that is just now more into everyone's stratosphere. That's what they've been doing for the last 5 years and then the last few months. And so how are they then navigating that? And just a reminder to everybody where I started with who they are as people and how they are different with that. My eldest daughter once sent me a short little cartoon video, and it's about a little, stick figure who has different interactions with people during the day who are going through very difficult things. And that person just gets heavier and heavier in the cartoon video because they take every piece of anything that they have seen that is sorrowful or hurtful or violent. And so for her, every day is a difficult unpacking and so the curation of the social media and the media that you mentioned, Mari, is very, very important to think about based on her personality and how she holds that and deeply holds that for periods of time. And so trying to navigate through that, and again, to Yassine's point around identities and not essentializing identities, my daughters have a very different relationship to who they are in terms of the skin they live in. My one daughter is very akin to her Chinese heritage roots. The other is much more engaged with her Blackness. Both of them are navigating both all the time, and there are shifts and changes in that daily, especially in these experiences. So, and then the other is just navigating this feeling of helplessness that they have either around their own situation or these larger issues that are happening, and trying to figure out ways in which they can navigate in the worlds that they exist, which are separate and distinct from mine, as well as deeply intertwined with mine, how they want to exert some influence and voice around how they feel about what is going on, whether that's with their circles of social connections with me, and then with sort of larger spheres within our family. The last thing I'll say to wrap up is, what I can tell you is the conversations I have with my extended family around this are very different than they would have been had that family now not, had we kept being like a mostly white family, which we were, the conversations would be different. And I think there's something to be thought about with respect to that, as you know, as we unpack whiteness and white supremacy and white privilege and white families who then intersect, as Mari has said, and find belovedness with those that they did not experience growing up, or that they were told horrible things about when they were growing up, that they conveyed horrible things about as parents themselves when we were growing up. And so I think they are honestly, they're having a lot more honest conversations with each other than I have ever seen before, because it just sort of wasn't talked about amongst them. It was only talked about with me in terms of how I could help them navigate it. And so I am seeing the conversation across my extended family happening in a different way.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that, and also for sharing and like what's personally how COVID has impacted like your family unit right now. I'm pretty sure that it's been difficult for you specifically around, especially around separation, and thank you for sharing around what's been happening in your extended family home units and how these conversations are percolating more and more, and being present to engage with them as we unpack these really difficult conversations together. And I want to just turn it to Yassine to just get his final points on the question at this time.
Yes, thank you so much for the excellent answers and thoughts. You know, I did have some answers in mind, but I'm changing it, you know, the more I listen to my respected panelists. You know, Malcolm X said, history is best qualified to reward all research. So because I have older children, we're able to have a lot of very deep conversations related to history, related to the history of struggle in this part of the world, related to this journey towards justice, racial justice for Black people in North America. And we're able to connect what is happening today to the struggle that has been going on for a very long time within the Black community for justice, freedom, and equality. My mother and father, who were born and raised in Jamaica, will often tell me about life, you know, in colonial Jamaica. And they will tell stories to my children about what it was like to be in Jamaica at that time, what it was like to first come to Canada in the 60s, and the racial discrimination that they experienced, and what it was like not to be victims, but rather to overcome and to be resilient and to struggle and to keep on pushing, right? I think the important part, the important lesson that we can take from what is happening today is that, you know, the history of struggle among Black people in this part of the world continues. It only takes different shapes in different times. That struggle for justice continues. And it can't be separate from what our parents and what our elders have gone through, right? That we don't read the stories of Malcolm X, who I mentioned, or the struggles of Martin Luther King, or even, the struggles that someone like Lincoln Alexander, who was the first Black MP to sit in the Canadian Parliament. That story of resilience is a story that should empower our children. And I think that, the protests that are happening today and the resistance that's going on needs to be connected to that story of resistance that has been going on for a very, very long time. And of course, again, because I have older children, and a few of which are in university, they're able to have these kind of, conversations where we can at least play the role of intellectual and try to place context, to what is happening today.
Thank you, Yassine, for sharing those comments, particularly around connecting the loop of how we should continue to share these stories that are happening presently when in respect to resilience, and connected back to the historical resilience that people of African descent and Black people have been pushing and fighting against in terms of racial injustice, both globally and within Canada. So thank you for that. And then we're going to move into our final question. And Michelle, I'm going to start with you. So over the years of having these dialogues and discussing racism and its impact on your family, share 3 tips, strategies, tools with those of us who are gathered here today that you've learned, and how do you have these conversations about race, racism, anti-Black racism in the home? And again, you're open to sort of expand on the question as you see fit.
Thank you, Nikki. This is a tricky one. So there's nothing, as was noted in my bio, there's no place that I learn more than in the interactions with the children in my life. And so to be the one providing tips feels very interesting to me. And I have joked for a very long time, and I wish I would say that it was a full joking, but some days it's a joking with, tears involved, that I was going to create t-shirts based on my experiences that said parenting and exercise and daily failure. And on the back, I would write usually before 9 a.m. because I feel like there are always things that I'm trying to improve upon. And so this question I found challenging because I can only convey what I try to do within my experiences and hope that they might be useful for others with respect to the very different experiences that everyone has. I had already mentioned that as a white parent, there are things I will never know. There are things I must always work to learn. And there are times I have to get out of the way because I will not have the lived experiences that my children have had and will continue to have. And I am very deeply grateful and fortunate and learned early on, because it's not something I necessarily would have come to easily. It's the importance of building networks of support. And I have very consciously chosen to do that with women in particular, and in particular to provide deep and direct connections where I am able for my children to engage with Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. Because the experiences of Black and racialized and Indigenous women and Asian women that are part of their heritage are so very often not considered when larger conversations around race and racism are discussed. There are so many things that intersect with respect to, both binaries in association with gender, as well as stereotypes in association with binary genders, assignments that never get considered. And I would have to say that the experiences of Black and other racialized women are frequently the last to be considered. And so I try as much as possible for the women in my life, they're women now, to be engaging with other Black women who can both bring experiences as peers as well as elders. Navigating the identities element is ever evolving. And as you know, my children are older as well. And as you start to look at, you know, aspects around sexuality and their engagement with that and how that intersects with their experiences of identity and their perceptions of race and racism that they deal with daily, all of these layers keep coming into that. And so the main thing that I try to do is to continue to have conversation and to be very honest in that conversation. And that is not for everyone. Not everybody wants to have all cards on the table with their kids, and I understand that. It's a personal decision that I have made, and at times it presents me as a parent in a way that shows my very deep flaws, and maybe that's not always the best thing, because parents do need to know that, or children do need to know that their parents are there for them, and that they can be strong for them. But at the same time, as Mari pointed out, that they need time to be vulnerable and to engage in their own care. And I never know if I'm getting that one right, like ever. So I have made a conscious decision to be very open and honest. And I'm not sure that that's always the right decision, but that's the decision I've made for myself. The other thing, I'm a white girl, man. And one thing that I have to take advantage of is that everybody likes a white mom in their system. Everybody likes a white girl at their post-secondary institution. And so I have to, again, I try to think about where I have influence, again, without appropriating my own children's experience, much less the experiences of other racialized communities, but where can I be useful to try and engage with systems and structures as a white person with mostly other white people who are still running those systems, to have conversations. And I fail at that all the time too, but I try to figure out how to navigate that and to do that. The last thing that I would say, and in particular in relation to my oldest daughter, who does, you know, take everything on, is that there's been a lot to take on. And the only thing I can think of to do in those circumstances is that there has been an incredible beauty in humanity, and always is an incredible beauty in humanity in very difficult and horrible times. And that's the only thing I can think of to continue to highlight that in dark moments, that this is what else happened today. This is where someone stood up. This is where someone decided to help to do something different. Sorry, I'll leave it there.
No worries, Michelle, nothing to apologize for. As I said, like, these conversations are good to have, and we need to be as raw and open and honest as possible. And like, I want to thank everybody on the panel so far, particularly as someone who is expecting, and like some of the considerations that I need to be mindful of as like I move in and transition into this role of being a parent. I do want to point out that I really liked your piece around like recognizing your own positionality and knowing that, you know, there's still unlearning work that we all have to do, that you have to do, and also stepping back and allowing your children to take lead. I really, really super appreciated that. And as well as ensuring that we build deep, meaningful connections to community and allow like our children and families access to these deep moments of relationship building. So I really, really appreciated that as well. And Mari, I want to get your take on this question.
Okay, I'm just kind of rethinking what I'm saying because Michelle said some of the stuff I was going to say. So I want to be useful by adding something slightly different. I'm going to say, the one thing I'm going to kind of build on what Michelle said is, I can't say enough about the piece about community. What I will add, not so I'm not repeating, is what we've also done is, that has been very beneficial for our household, is to say these are trusted adults. That you're not going to be able to come to me for every conversation. For whatever reason, I'm not under the illusion that my kids are going to come to me for everything, not the least of which I'm a very light-skinned Black woman. My experiences are different, and my partner is a different human being and has different comfort levels in what he's going to talk about. So we have said, when you need to, Auntie Hollis, when you need to, Auntie Emily, when you need to, we have that these people have my complete trust to speak for me in those moments. I also say to those people, you don't have to report back to me. So I really want to hold that. The other thing I'll say is that we have tried to create a regular practice as a family of noticing, like I talked about, noticing what's happening, noticing everything from our language. When you're making a play date with someone new, who are your grown-ups? Not assuming the identities or genders or family makeup, because families look like so many different ways. So like being really mindful about noticing and languaging and feeling and taking care of our feelings about what's going on, and also responding, linking what Michelle said. In our household has been really helpful because of the work that O and I are involved in, because we're both in equity and access and anti-oppression work, talking about local heroes. You know, I've worked with this person, this is what this person did, and I want it to be local. You know, I got to work with Jean Augustine, I got to work with Akua Benjamin, I got, you know, Daddy's working with Carl James. I want to, and building up what Yassine was saying, building up local heroes around heroes is a difficult word. People who are in action. But this also has to be in the larger context of things. One of the things I say to my kids when we've kind of gone through the carrying of a feeling of emotion, remember this. Remember how you feel, because there will be another moment in the future where you witness this happening, or you say something that makes someone feel like this. Remember how this feels, so that you can act. You can think about and have a human-to-human connection with that person, and that you know that your expectation from us is to consider your safety, consider everybody's safety, analyze the situation, and act. And if you don't have the words, just go stand beside them. So that this is placed in a larger context of what happens in the world, and that us as a larger community, and our responsibility to each other to be present and in action for one another. Okay. The last thing I'm going to say about that, the last thing I'll offer is models of differentness, and making it okay and talking about the different ways that we as a family process things. For example, Daddy's going to go for his jog. Mommy's going to meditate. Right? We have different ways of caring for ourselves. When something happens and we're upset, Daddy and Big need some space, right? Mommy and we're more like, let's talk about it and hang out and call a friend and go out and do something and interact with people. So being mindful and reading and learning how to read each other around, how do I care for another human? What do I need? And how do I care for the relationships around me? How am I mindful of that? As related to all this issue as well, right? And to be able to say to my little one who just wants to do everything with the big kiddo, right? This is a hard moment. Here's why. Remember, we talked about that. Remember, this is also how Big Kid processes things, right? So one of the ways that we show care and love is to give some space. And maybe you can draw a picture and pop it under her door, right? So thinking about the different ways that we care. So my buzzer.
Sorry, a little difficulty unmuting my mic there. Thank you, Mari, for sharing that. I really enjoyed in terms of, again, like how, and both you and Michelle have touched on this, and as well as Yassine, around like different identities of the young people in your life and how they cope and respond to different things, and being responsive around what they need. And I really enjoyed hearing from all of you around that, as well as looking at the chat, remembering how you feel that seems to have struck a nerve with people, and especially like even in the moments where you can't find the words and you consider the safety of yourself, your surroundings, safety of others, that at least if you can't find the words in that moment, that you can stand next to the person to provide that opportunity of support and solidarity when they're going through difficult moments. So I really enjoyed that practical tip for kids. And Yassine, I just want to take your last, before we move into the Q&A, your thoughts on this final question.
Yes. As the chaplain, I'm often asked the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Or why do unfair things happen to those who are innocent? Well, the response I usually offer is, a better question to ask is, what is your response? What is your response? Because if we did understand why, bad things happen to good people, perhaps we would become numb to the pain, to the suffering of people. We might rationalize it to the point where we would not be engaged in solutions. So the first tip perhaps I could offer my brothers and sisters and friends is to say, we should focus on responses to racism, responses to discrimination. We are in an intellectual environment. We spend a lot of time around intellectuals and people who make a living from thinking and writing. Sometimes that can be very numbing because we talk about why certain things happen, and we unpack this to the point where we forget actually about how practically to respond to certain things, respond to suffering, respond to oppression. My first advice is to make sure that we are responding and we're not getting trapped in this, this circle of talking, this circle of reflecting. For now, it's okay. We have a program to engage. We're going to finish very soon, but after this, we have to actually start to respond in a very practical way. What we have to do as well within our homes, with our children, is we have to set an example. It may seem obvious, but I think it's worth repeating here today that we have to set an example. We can't give to our children what we don't have. We can't give to our children what we don't have. So therefore, we have to set a very high standard of behavior, of engagement, of activism, and transmit that to our children. That's very, very important because, knowledge is not transmitted through books, it's transmitted through people. And it's people that inspire other people to do good and to serve, right? We also have to be open about addressing mistakes. Be very open about addressing the mistakes that our children may make. And we have to make sure that we don't constrict our children when it comes to how they wish to engage the world. Don't constrict them. Allow them to make mistakes, but we have to provide a safe space for them to be corrected. That's very, very important, because what will happen is if we make a mistake in how we communicate the truth to our children, it might actually produce a lot of dysfunction. Because after all, our first role as a parent is to teach and to transmit knowledge, to transmit goodness. That's the first inheritance that our children will receive from a parent. So we have to make sure that we provide a space for them to actually make mistakes and allow them to receive, constructive criticism or correction, when they find themselves in error. And as well, we have to remind ourselves that, and perhaps I'll delve into my, chaplaincy space just for a moment, if you'll permit me. We have not been created to have an easy life. We're not guaranteed by the creator, the one, the omnipotent force, however you refer to that sacred divine energy. We have not been created to have an easy life. That it is, the nature of life to struggle and to push and to be tested. We have to remind our children that, they're not guaranteed ease, they're not guaranteed comfort, they're not guaranteed, freedom from those awkward moments. In Jamaica, they say, "Rain a fall, but dirty tough." Rain a fall, but dirty tough, which means, the rain falls from the sky, which is a symbol of blessing. It's a symbol of blessing. But the rain falls on a ground that is tough, that's hard, right? The blessing is received, right? we all receive the blessing, regardless whether we're good or bad, whether we're, you know, whether we're the oppressed or the oppressor. The rain comes to everybody, okay? But the ground itself remains tough, right? So life remains tough. We have to continue to grind. We have to continue to work. So I think that's a very important lesson for our children, especially as it relates to resilience. As it relates to resilience, right? So these are some of the, you know, tips and some advice that I could offer, you know, my friends, you know, this morning.
Thank you, Yassine, for that, for providing practical tips. The chat is going off around what it is you said, particularly around the restriction of allowing your children to make mistakes and creating an environment where they can unpack these mistakes at home and with the people in their lives. And also reminding us around the actionability of these things, that like knowledge is active and it's not to just sit in a book, that how we respond needs to also, in addition to engaging in knowledge and learning, that we also need to take action and be responsive and thinking about this after this particular call. So I want to thank all three of you for providing us with your stories and for sharing with us part of yourselves, particularly through this like Q&A portion. I'm going to turn it around so I'm going to be moderating questions from the audience. So I'm just mindful of time. So the time is about 11:18. So we have some time for maybe about 3 questions from the audience if people want to post it in, and I will sort of read it aloud. There was a question that, or more of a commentary, I don't know if you want to speak to around the clarification of like Black identity when you initially said. So a couple of comments were in the chat were there unclear. So I just want to know if you wanted to take a moment to sort of expand upon that. I'm not sure if you remember what I was referring to or am I referring to?
Yes, in fact, I was taking a look at the chat and I saw the question, and it's a very good question and it deserves some clarification. I did mention that, yes, there is no such thing as a default Blackness. I stand by that. As well, there is diversity concerning, you know, how we define a Black or an African identity. There is some healthy debate within the Black African community about exactly, you know, how do we categorize and classify ourselves, right? Those who use the term Black see it mainly as an experience, an experience that revolves once again around resilience, around the journey towards freedom, justice, and equality. However, we have a memory of Africa. You know, I joke with my friends who have, you know, emigrated from the African continent, and I say, you know, the only difference is that, you know, my ancestors came on slave ships and you came on Air Canada, but we're all Africans. We're all Africans. So what I really meant to say was that how we define Blackness can relate to our different experience. The way a Black person in Brazil may experience Blackness in a very different way from how it's experienced in Jamaica. Or for example, how someone who is classified as Black on the Swahili coast of Africa may experience it much different from a Nubian in Egypt. I'm saying there is a diversity of stories, a diversity of memories concerning what this term Black may mean. So I simply meant to say that we have to be careful about, you know, creating unnecessary borders about what that term Black may mean, and not to universalize our own experience being Black upon those whom we identify as Black around the world. This is what I meant.
Thank you for providing that clarification. So we do have like a couple of questions in the chat to reach out for us, and also look into our website. We will be posting this video once, you know, all the post-production is done. So I want to just pause the conversation here for now, but do check us out later on, maybe in next week or a week after. And I want to turn it over to Director of the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, Jody Glean, to close us off.
Hi, everyone. At a point, I saw that we were 400 numbers strong. These past few sessions that we've that ARCDO had the privilege of hosting over the course of 2 weeks have been nothing short of powerful. I cannot find another word to use to describe that. And they're powerful because of the voices that have contributed so selflessly to the varying discussion topics. And so Yassine, Mari, Michelle, thank you. Thank you so, and Kay, thank you so very much for contributing to this space. For this particular topic, I didn't want to sit on the panel because I was frightened I'd cry. And I noticed that there were some questions in the chat around for younger audiences. You know, I enter into this reflection as a Black woman, a Black mother of a 4-year-old. I also enter into this conversation with the status of being a wife to a Black man and sister to Black brothers. And I'm continuously having these conversations. And I find when it comes to my family members, I'm continuously having conversations about being safe and protecting yourself. You know, my husband, he's a plumber. And so at times it requires him to go into residential houses. And I am continuously saying, please put on a body camera, put on an audio record, do what you have to do to protect yourself. Don't walk into those spaces by yourself because you do not know who you're going to be interacting with. And so when it comes to talking about racism in the home, from my perspective, is a continuous plea for being safe and being careful. And that in of itself is tiring. And when it comes to my daughter, who's 4 years old, first and foremost, I was raised in the Caribbean. So Yassine, I really appreciated your components around the definition of Blackness and how we have to stretch that. Because these conversations were not conversations I was having on my tiny little island of Grenada. And the conversations and narratives that we're holding now around definitions of Blackness and Black identity has taken on a different conversation as I live in Canada. And now as I live in Canada as a mom. And I'm continuously reinforcing for my 4-year-old daughter her understanding of Blackness. I'm always saying, oh, you're so beautiful, my Black princess. And, you know, sometimes she'll be looking at YouTube videos that are primarily of non-Black, white children, sometimes even Asian children. And she's like, I love their hair, mommy. And I'm like, but your hair is prettier. I am continuously in a space of reinforcing her beauty because I understand from my own perspectives and from my own understandings the importance of having to do so. So there's no, for the persons who are asking, how do we have this for our 4, 5, 3-year-olds, 6-year-olds? My gosh, there's no right way. But the only caveat I would say is, but have the conversation early, because there is some force teaching our children the definitions of blue equals boy and pink equals girls. There's something teaching them that straight blonde hair is pretty. That didn't go, you know, and not to speak to that the diversity of all of who we are isn't beautiful. But what I'm speaking to is that there's a lack of messaging around how beautiful her Black identity is. And I'm continuously reflecting on the need to reinforcing that and in various ways that we should all be mindful of, whether it's books, whether it's and the toys that she's playing with, etc. But also for parents here, be critical with your teachers. And I would invite everyone to do so. Ask questions. What books are you using? Can I see the diverse representations within the story times? What about the toys that they're playing with? My little one is starting JK. Can you assure me that there is diversity in the ranges of activities and materials that they're going to be using? What is the makeup of your teaching staff? That's one of the first questions I asked when I was seeking out daycares. And I would like to invite that we all ask those questions. We all want to have that diversity, because we know without that form of diversity, there's no excellence, there's no innovation, there's no growth, and there's no beauty. And so I just wanted to leave those points there as I close. I want to thank you so very much, profoundly, for the contributions into the chat, for the resources shared, and for the voices and expertise shared today. To all of the folks working behind the scenes, Nikki, Samuel, Simon Beggs, Sabrina, and Will Campbell, thank you for providing all of the infrastructure support for allowing these sessions to happen. And for all individuals, know that this may be the last of this series, the Anti-Racism Office. We have some regrouping to do. We have some resting to do. And then we will be launching a few more sessions coming forward, which will be very reflective of what's coming for the year. And believe me, we'll be open for us as a community, both at UFT, City of Toronto, and nationwide, because I know there's some folks joining us from outside the city, that they will be open for us to continue this dialogue. So thank you so very much. And I leave you all this afternoon. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye, everyone. Thank you.